Another subtopic in talking about ethnic conflict is to be differentiating between the different types of ethnic conflict which exist in the world. Some of them, and almost all of them, exist in the world somewhere at any time, sadly including genocide. So let's go into full screen and let's read together and think about and talk about the following types of conflict, of ethnic conflict. These range from genocide, and examples are given about the Armenian genocide in the First World War, the Holocaust in the Second World War, and Rwanda in the mid-90s, ethnic riots that occur in different parts of the world. The following riots in the US are mentioned, and there have been some famous ethnic riots, race riots in Malaysia in the 1960s. Secession, irredentism is another form of ethnic conflict. Exclusion is another form of ethnic conflict. Expulsion and social exclusion. Ethnic riots. So we've talked quite a bit about genocides, and I don't think that we need to do that anymore now. Ethnic riots are similar to genocides insofar as the conflict takes violent, indeed often deadly forms. Riots differ from genocide insofar as they typically involve less planning and often have the appearance of being spontaneous. What is often most evident to the third-party observer is the highly charged emotional nature of a riot. Horowitz definition nicely summarised such violence in the following way. A deadly ethnic riot is an intense, sudden, though not necessarily wholly unplanned, lethal attack by civilian members of one ethnic group on civilians of another ethnic group. The victims are chosen because of their group membership. We would modify that definition slightly by pointing out that in some ethnic riots, the rioters primarily target the property of other ethnic groups rather than the persons. Horowitz goes on to note that depending on the context, these are sometimes referred to as communal, racial, religious, linguistic, or tribal disturbances. The underlying reasons precipitating riots are varied, but share in common a sense of collective grievance. The grievance can be due to a sense that the group has been squeezed out of or placed in a disadvantaged position in the economy, in the labour market, as consumers and so forth. Or it can be a parallel feeling of disenfranchisement from the centres of political power. It can result from ill feelings about authorities, such as a belief that the police or the courts have been unfair to members of the ethnic group. In the case of immigrants, members of the dominant ethnic group in the receiving country may view the newcomers as a competitive threat or as a challenge to social order, while immigrants may view themselves as the victims of discriminatory practices that put them at a distinct disadvantage as they attempt to gain a foothold in their new home. While underlying reasons for ethnic riots vary, they share in common a certain patterned character to the riot itself. There's a precipitating event, the event that sparks the violence, mobilisation of people, relies on rumours and in these days social media to heighten the sense of collective anger and perceived injustice. Horowitz observes that there is often a lull preceding the riots where people acquire the emotional state of mind that propels them, and this involves intensifications of anger, the reduction of fear, etc. Ethnic riots take place in both developed and underdeveloped nations, though Horowitz thinks that the number of such events taking place in the former is declining. Evidence of the locations of ethnic riots that took place during the first decades of the 20th century led credence to Horowitz's assessment. That being said, ethnic riots have not disappeared from developed countries. As illustrations of the rhythm of an ethnic riot, we examined two riots in the US, and they deal with the Chicago riots of 1919 and the Los Angeles riot of 1992. But we're not going to deal with that. We're going to go on and talk about the next form of ethnic violence, and that is succession. A third type of conflict occurring between ethnic groups with territorial claims attempts to leave an existing nation state in order to establish a new one. Whereas the two preceding types of conflict are by their nature violent, succession movements may not be violent. They may be non-violent. Successionist ethnic groups are ethno-national, that is to say, they are based on nationalist ideology and a conviction that although they are a nation, they lack statehood. So remember the important term, a nation state. Okay, so some nations do not have states. And those are called stateless nations, nations without states. The goal of succession movements is to create an independent state with the acquisition of regional autonomy while remaining in the existing nation, serving in many instances as a fallback position. And so a local example is Aceh, top of Sumatra, which have negotiated regional autonomy. A partial list of recent or current examples of succession movements that have resulted in civil war and armed conflict and terrorism include the following. So you'll see that in the book, but let's go on to look at the next type, and that's irredentism. And irredentism is a phenomenon that bears similarities to succession, and it occurs when ethnic groups span national boundaries and an effort is made to unite them. There are far fewer irredentalist movements than successionist movements. The conditions for irredentism, where they exist in the developing world, have often been due to map drawing activities of colonial governments or the international community, particularly when those activities have ignored traditional tribal boundaries. However, one can also find examples in Europe, such as Albanians living in Serbia and Hungarians residing in Romania, and there are other examples, the Irish in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. In addition to irredentism, there is another type of ethnic conflict, and that is exclusion. Exclusion occurs when a more powerful ethnic group in a nation prevents a less powerful group from entering their territory or forcibly expelling it if the group is already there. But it can also occur when the more powerful ethnic group renders the less powerful group relatively powerless and marginalised as either permanent aliens or second-class citizens who are prevented from entering the societal mainstream. Exclusion is the most common form of ethnic conflict, one that can occur with or without violence. Though if it does so without violence, resistance. The powerful groups have the potential for relying on force if they meet resistance from the excluded groups. Exclusion is a boundary defining process, one that determines who is to be seen and treated as an insider and who is seen and treated as an outsider. 3 examples illustrate each type of exclusion. Forcing ethnic groups to leave territory where they have settled constitutes a form of exclusionary conflict. In the US, American Indians have been excluded from their traditional tribal lands and placed elsewhere, and we saw examples of that when we dealt with the ethnic diversity of the USA. And so, in the state of Israel in 1948, when that was created, Jews from Europe and elsewhere chose to settle in the new country. Perhaps as many as 1 million Palestinians fled and were forced into exile. The largest number of those refugees ended up in Jordan, where refugee camps were created shortly afterwards. And given the fact that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians remained unresolved for over half a century, the refugees continue to live in these camps under the auspices of the UN, and they are the 3rd largest population in Jordan, a form of exclusion. In the US, the Jim Crow era in the United States and the apartheid system in South Africa are prominent examples of racial exclusion and subordination. And I am sure that you are aware of the history of both of those forms of ethnic conflict and social exclusion. Okay, so let's go out of full screen now, and we can make some concluding comments. This chapter points to the dark side of ethnicity, which is its capacity to be the source of conflict in situations where 2 or more groups interact with each other. While deeply rooted historical animosities no doubt play a role in many instances of conflict, it is clearly not true in all cases. Moreover, even when a history of tension exists, the primary factors leading to conflict involve competing interests, both material and in terms of ideas. We surveyed 5 types of conflict: genocide, ethnic riots, succession, irredentism, and exclusion. These are ideal types, which means that concrete instances of ethnic conflict are often a mixture of these types, and furthermore, more than one type of conflict can be prevented at the same time. Implicit in the examples presented is a criticism of those who would suggest that ethnic conflict are inevitable. To make this claim, it is necessary to rely on essentialist notions of ethnic identity and ethnic relations. In contrast, the social constructivist perspective we subscribe to would have one assume that just as conflicts arise out of specific actions of actors, individual and collective, in interaction with others, so the elimination, de-escalation, and the taming of conflict by offering it legitimate and civil channels to expression are all possible. Okay, so we will be revisiting this important aspect of ethnicity, and I'm going to be revisiting from different angles alternative ways of understanding what is going on in South Thailand, which can be understood as irredentism, if you believe that some Malay actors are wanting to join Malaysia, or separatism, if you think that that in South Thailand, in Patani Yala Naratiwat, a entirely new nation state is seeking to be formed, and these, whether they are irredentism movements or whether they are successionist movements, we'll be talking a bit more later on in the course, not now, but a bit later on, about how social exclusion, how discrimination, how language discrimination, how the marginalisation of the Malay language have contributed to this subnational conflict, which is the most one of a number of ethnic conflicts which exist in Thailand now. So thanks for watching, and we'll go on to the next chapter soon.